Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
This podcast, The Question Lane, it's a podcast where we try to focus on solving problems through the process of questions and answers. In this particular episode, I want to focus on Area 2, education. Specifically, I want to focus on your article, How Dual Enrollment Contributes to Inequality. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Gilbert.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, what would you like for me to refer to you as? Professor Gilbert, Eric, or
Eric
do you have a
fine.
specific name?
Nah, Eric.
Okay, perfect.
It's fine.
Perfect. Is there anything you want our audience to know about you before we get started?
Well, I'm not I kind of came late to working on higher education policy issues. I kind of made a move into what is now called critical university studies, but my original training is in East African and Indian Ocean history, 19th and 20th century. So I'm not trained in political science. I don't do social science methods or anything like that. So everything I have to say is pretty much me reading other people's research articles. It's not based on me going out and doing, statistically sophisticated studies of things. I kind of look at lists and see what's at the top, that kind of thing, rather than being a real social sciences researcher.
So basically, you analyze research that you see on topics that you're interested in, and you provide your opinion pieces on that.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
And so I use sort of historian
what
skills to. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to just say I use kind of a historian's critical reading skills to approach problems that are not specifically historical. And so, although everything, of course, is historical from a historian's perspective.
Why did you become a professor in history? What motivated you to put yourself in that type of discipline and focus on that as a career path?
Well, it's kind of a convoluted route. I was originally a classicist. I did Greek and Latin. And I realized, I did Greek and Latin, and then I spent a bunch of time as a ski bum. And when I decided I needed a grown-up job, I thought originally the logical thing for me to do was to become a high school history teacher. And I kind of started down that path and realized that I really would not be a good high school history teacher. So I applied for a history graduate program. And when it came time to work on a PhD, I had grown up in West Africa. My father worked for USAID, the Agency for International Development. So I spent most of my childhood in West Africa. And then when I was college age, my parents were living in East Africa. And so when it came time for me to look into a PhD program, I already had some African language training. I could speak French and a little bit of Swahili. And it seemed like a natural path to go into East Africa, Indian Ocean stuff. So that's how I ended up going that route.
What countries did you stay in while you were in Africa?
Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon. And then when I was in college, my parents were stationed in Tanzania. So I spent my summers and Christmases in Tanzania. I never lived there full time, except later on. I was a Fulbrighter in Zanzibar, which is sort of a semi-autonomous part of Tanzania. And then later on, my parents were in Sudan and Cote d'Ivoire. And I spent a couple of weeks in each of those places visiting them, but I've never lived in either of those countries. But we moved to Ghana when I was 2, so I spent most of kind of grade school years in Ghana and Nigeria, middle school, Cameroon, and then I went to high school in the U.S. because there was no English language high school in Cameroon when we were there.
You are a white male, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
What was your experience like growing up in that type of environment where you saw people that were so different from you economically, I guess physically, and all of those different metrics?
Well, it's hard. That's a very common question. People will ask, what was it like having a childhood like that? But when it's the only childhood you've had, it's hard to compare it to. other childhoods or other lives. So for me, that's just sort of normal, or it was normal. I think the biggest difference, I think particularly even the biggest difference compared to what that experience would be like now. I mean, we're talking about we moved to Ghana in 1966. So independence in Ghana was 1958. So that was, less than a decade from independence. And when we got to Nigeria, I think Nigeria got its independence in 1964. And we moved there in 1970. And so, the situation was still far more colonial than it would be now. There were still fairly large numbers of people, Brits, Britons, and other Europeans who had sort of stayed on in those places after independence. And I believe, particularly in Nigeria, that's less true now. Now, and Ghana, of course, had a substantial African middle class, and it sort of goes back to the colonial period. And so Ghana's kind of unusual. And so my parents' social circle was had a lot of European or U.S. educated Ghanaians in it. There are a surprising number of Ghanaians in the 60s who had gone to school in the U.S., sometimes on scholarships and things like that, but sometimes just because their families could afford to send them. Ghana had the cocoa industry had produced a fairly large African middle class. And so it was commonplace for us in Ghana for as a child to have African friends visiting and things like that to visit my parents. That was somewhat true in Nigeria. It was much less true in Tanzania. And I don't know if that was because of how things had changed by the 80s, or if it's just a different sort of. There was a smaller African middle class in Tanzania. It had always been a somewhat poorer country than either Ghana or Nigeria. It hadn't had the sort of colonial era investment that a place like Ghana had had. I think it was different in different countries. And on some level, being a sort of a white child in West Africa in the 60s and 70s, you're a minority, but you're a very privileged minority. There's still enough kind of a colonial era deference that there were still elements of that in circulation in the 80s that I think would not, or the 60s and 70s, that would not be present anymore. I think that's really changed.
And just to follow up quickly on what you said about colonialism, can you briefly explain what that is and in a few sentences and try to inform our viewers on what you mean when you use the term colonialism?
Okay, well, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon were all colonies of European countries. In the case of Ghana and Nigeria, it was the British, and Cameroon was colonized by both first by the Germans, and then after World War I, Germany was forced to give up all of its colonies after World War I, and the British and the French, who had defeated the Germans in World War I, divided up Cameroon into a British sector and a German sector, British sector and a French sector. But that in West Africa, colonialism mostly meant sort of administration by the colonial power, Ghana and Nigeria. That would have been the British. There weren't a whole lot of settlers. There weren't. It's not like colonial North America or even colonial South America, where you had large numbers of Europeans moving in and taking up residence. That didn't happen a lot in West Africa. Is mostly the kind of governmental structure was European. In East Africa, Kenya in particular, there was a substantial white settler population, which produces a really different dynamic when you have farms being owned by Europeans. Tanzania had a small settler population, some Germans and then some Britons who had come after Tanzania had also started out as a German colony, and then became a British colony after World War I. Technically, it was a League of Nations mandate, but it was, for all intents and purposes, a colony. So Tanzania was a little different in that it had a small settler population, farmers, but not nearly the scale that Kenya or Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, or South Africa had. So in all those cases, you have a European power that comes in, takes over by one mechanism or another, and then sets up a government there, and sort of manages things usually in ways that are meant to benefit the economy of the mother country, in Britain or France, in terms of producing raw materials for British industry or French industry. In the case of Nigeria, they tried to produce cotton to sell to British textile manufacturers. In the case of Ghana, it's less kind of clear tie to European industry. They were, or British industry. In Ghana, they were producing mostly cocoa for chocolate, but a few other agricultural products for export.
So
that's
today,
colonialism in a nutshell. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So today, would you suspect that most of the exports for these countries, are they doing business with other African countries, or are they mainly doing business with Europe?
Well, and of course, now it's more complicated than doing business with Europe. A lot of African countries trade heavily with China and India and the Middle East, because they're big consumer markets for raw materials there. It is agricultural products are often sold to Europe, but services and things like that are now increasingly sold within the continent. Nigeria, for instance, the film industry in Nigeria, known as Nollywood, is, in terms of titles produced, the biggest film industry in the world, and most of it is direct to DVD. So doesn't go to theaters, but they produce huge numbers of DVDs, and those are sold all over the continent. So you could be in Congo, you could be in South Africa, you could be in Kenya, and if you go to a DVD store, you're going to be buying Nigerian sitcoms, dramas, soap operas, whatever. Music, again, a kind of a service industry type thing, is sold very much within the continent. Congo, soukous and music like that, produced in Congo. A lot of it is actually Congolese artists who work out of France, but that's sold all over Africa. So they're commoditized stuff, copper, coal, products like that tend to be, raw material type stuff tends to be exported either to China or to the West. Petroleum exported to all over the place. And not that much intra-African trade. But in some of these new sectors, there's actually a growing intra-African trade in those things. Right now, the biggest brewer on the continent, and in fact, I think the largest black-owned company in the world is SABC Miller, or SAB Miller, South Africa Breweries, which also owns Miller. And it produces beer all over the African continent. And then they sell products like Castle Lager, which is a SAB product, all over the continent. So much so that it's kind of driving out local beers. So there are intra-African trades that have developed since the colonial era. But the colonial era is very much built around sort of intra-imperial trade. So the British were very anxious to ensure that goods that were produced in Ghana or Nigeria went to Britain or somewhere else in the empire. So there was a certain amount of trade to and from India from East Africa, because that was considered desirable trade within the British Empire. Okay,
so now I'm going to dive into your article here.
Okay.
How dual enrollment contributes to inequality. So one thing that I try to focus on here on the podcast is words and definitions, so that myself and others are clear on what's being written and said. So the first word I want to focus on is inequality, which is in your title. What do you mean when you use the word inequality?
Well, that's actually a good question, because I thought a lot about what I meant by dual enrollment, but less about what I mean by inequality. I think in that particular context, what we're talking about is inequality of opportunity. The sort of relative ease with which upper middle class, usually white, not in Arkansas but in other places, probably Asian also, students are able to navigate the university system both financially and culturally, compared to other groups, particularly minorities, who may not have the kind of cultural knowledge of how these things work, but also don't often have the financial means to make things work as easily or as effectively for themselves. So in this particular context, I think that's the type of inequality I'm talking about.
So would a maldistribution of resources for people who may be classified as not white, minority, etc., would that be, I guess, an accurate summation of what you're saying when you use the word inequality in this case?
Well, I think resources are part of it, but I think some of it is just kind of cultural knowledge and a sort of a structural function that isn't necessarily tied to resources. In the case of what we're talking about, some of it I think has to do with money. And I think the dual enrollment system was developed with very little thought and very little intentionality. I'm surprised actually at how little discussion of it there is, and how little thought has gone into it, because I think it's in a way has been more transformative of American higher education than online had. And whereas online and distance learning has gotten all kinds of attention, criticism, and things like that. And I think that's because there are ways to make money off of online education. There are businesses that make money off of it. Universities try to make money off of it. They usually lose their money to the businesses that are making money off of it. But with online, with dual enrollment, nobody's figured out how to make a buck off of it. And so I think it's kind of slipped under the radar. So I think whatever's going on with it, it's not part of some kind of complicated scheme to enhance inequality. I think it was probably intentioned to create opportunities for people who might not otherwise, to make it cheaper for people to go to college. But the sort of unintended consequence of this has been to make it cheaper for people for whom college was probably already reasonably affordable, and it hasn't done nearly as much to help people for whom college is a more difficult goal to reach.
In the article, you state that there's been a notable demographic shift from 5 years ago. You said that the students in your general education classes are disproportionately minorities, adults, and graduates of rural high schools. And you're teaching fewer middle and suburban white students as you have in the past. In your experience, do you think that these students are less prepared than the students that may have been in your classes in the past, or are you thinking that they're positioned to be in the correct position because there's more teacher interaction because of the small class size?
The small class size in my classes, or the small class size in high schools?
Well, no, small class sizes in your classes, since you said that there's not 40 students as they were in the past. They're just smaller and smaller numbers of students. Yeah,
unfortunately, and this is an idiosyncrasy of my own institution, and this may be very different in other places. We have this tendency, we've got all these classrooms that will accommodate about 40 to 50 students. And that is like the most inefficient size for a college class. It's not big enough to be efficient in terms of your numbers, and it's not really small enough to be intimate. Like a class of 15 students can be really different than a class of 40, but a class of 40 isn't that different from a class of 300. so we lose the efficiency of having these big lecture sections. So even though those classes are smaller, they tend to be about 35 or 30. And for a lot of the students, that's still not, they're not comfortable having a discussion in a class that big. So I don't know that that anybody is gaining anything from a smaller, the kind of lower enrollment gen ed classes that they wouldn't have gotten when there were 40 or 45 students in those classes. I think what's the main thing, what drove my observation is I used to be really active in our honors program when I first got to Arkansas State. So 20 years ago, I was teaching honors classes that would have about 15 students in them. We met in a seminar room, so students would sit around a table, so they're all facing each other instead of me. And you could have a very good class where I lectured some, but we discussed, they talked to each other, I talked to them. And that was kind of rolling along pretty well. And I should point out that those classes, the sort of students who ended up in our honors program were predominantly white suburbanites. Mostly, some of them drawn from our part of Northeast Arkansas, but a lot of them from the Little Rock suburbs. And then I went to work in the administration for 3 years and never thought much about concurrent enrollment because I was working on graduate school things and it just wasn't my world. And the next time I taught an honors class, after I left the graduate school, which was 3 years ago, I think, there were only 3 students in my class. And we've since stopped offering standalone world history honors classes. And I think the reason for that, this at a time when our honors college has doubled almost in size. But none of those students need to take world history anymore because they all took it in high school and got college credit for it. Meanwhile, in the non-honors classes, enrollments are down, but they're down, they're down in general. College enrollments are nationwide down right now. But I would say there's about a 10 or 15% drop in the overall size of my world history survey courses. And what's missing are the sort of non-honors student, white middle-class students who would have taken those courses 20 years ago, because they too, like the honors students, have taken all those classes in high school. So there's a kind of a different mix, both a slightly, I think the shrunken size is less significant than the change in the sort of mix of students in those classes. And some of the students in those classes are less well prepared than you would like them to be, but that's always been the case in a regional comprehensive university like ours, where we teach students with a really broad range of preparation, from people who probably were their socioeconomic situation not different, would have gone to Vanderbilt or something, to people who are really not ready to be in college. And so we've always had a complicated mix of students in our classes. But I think there's been and that's still true in the upper level classes, but the gen ed classes are increasingly, the better prepared, wealthier, and more suburban you are, the less likely you are to show up in a gen ed class anymore. Which I think is detrimental to everyone. I think it's detrimental to students who miss out on the experience of taking gen ed in college, because I do think there's a difference between taking a gen ed course in college from a college professor. I think it's detrimental to students who maybe are less well prepared and might have been sort of exposed to those stronger students in those classes. One of the kind of dirty secrets of higher education is that students learn more from each other than they do from their professors, or that at least that's a significant part of it. And so the better prepared students kind of bring up the whole level of the class, and I think they benefit, their presence benefits everyone, and taking them out of the equation is detrimental to the whole process. And I think the other reason, the other sort of unfair aspect of this is that if you show up in college with 20 credits, 25 credits, 30 credits, I've seen people show up with as many as 36 credits, basically their whole freshman year done. College is only going to be 3 years for you, maybe 4. And so there are fewer potential disasters that are going to happen to you. Your car breaks down, you lose a job, you get a parent gets sick, or something like that might deflect you from your off your career or your college trajectory. By contrast, if you're in college for 6 years or 5 or 6 years, which is now the norm for how long it takes for most people to get a undergraduate degree, and you show up with almost no undergraduate credits, there's a lot more time for something to go wrong financially for you, something with your family, something with your health, that it's going to push you off your path. So I think it exposes some students to more risk of some sort of catastrophe that deflects them from their direction in college.
So these dual enrollment courses that high school students are able to take, are these programs that are available to all school districts in the state of Arkansas and nationwide, or are these determined based on state directors of education or the local level? What do you think is driving that force to say which school is able to have these type of programs that create some of these widening gaps in educational attainment?
Well, I think first, I think it's worth stopping for a moment to talk about what dual enrollment is, because it can mean many different things in different contexts. So there's about 3 different ways that dual enrollment works. One is for students to actually physically attend classes at a community college or a university near them. So at some high schools, and in some states this is a much more common model, students, I don't know if they put them on a bus or they drive their cars or whatever, and they go over to the community college and they take, freshman literature or something like that. And then they go back to the high school. And so they're physically on a college campus with a college teacher, and separate from their high school life when they do that. So that's one way of doing dual enrollment. And then that course would count both for their high school and college. This is why it's called dual enrollment. You satisfy your college requirement, or you satisfy your high school requirement for the English or math class or whatever, but you also get college credit for it, and in effect get to treat your high school class as also satisfying some giving you credit and allowing you to say you've taken freshman lit or college algebra or whatever when you get to college. The other way, or another way of doing that, is for a community college or university teacher to physically come to the high school and teach the class in the high school. That happens in some places. The most common model, particularly in Arkansas, so I don't know about other states as much with that, is for a high school teacher who has a master's degree, at least in our part of the country, where the Higher Learning Commission, HLC, is the accrediting body. Their requirement for these courses is that the instructor have a master's degree in something, and 18 credit hours in the field that he or she is teaching. So you could have a master's of science in education, just in sort of generic education. But if you've got 18 hours, graduate hours of physics, you could teach a college-level physics course. And people like to say, so well, the accreditors hold these programs to the same standards that they do in college. And it's true, the same bare minimums apply for a college-level instructor teaching undergraduates as apply to the dual enrollment programs in the high schools. But I would like to think that the vast majority of people teaching at the college level are, especially given the just overproduction of PhDs all over the place, are not people with a master's degree in something and 18 credit hours in their discipline. I'm sure that happens, but I expect it's relatively uncommon. By contrast, for high schools, that is not an uncommon scenario. So that, I think, is the most common model. You have a teacher with a master's degree, your high school English teacher or your high school math teacher or whatever, who has a master's degree and 18 credit hours in the discipline, and then that person teaches a class on behalf of a community college or a university, and the student is dual enrolled. They get an ID from the university. They pay a modest tuition to the university. Sometimes it's as little as $80 or something like that. But they are technically enrolled simultaneously in the university, but they're being taught by the high school teacher who's been sort of deputized as a college level instructor. And then the university or community college usually has some oversight of syllabi and textbooks and stuff like that. So those are the way that's what we mean. If you're talking about definitions, that's what we mean when we talk about dual enrollment. I don't think any state government is trying to stop the expansion of dual enrollment. I don't think there's any system whereby, and I may be wrong about this because there's 50 different states and there's probably almost as many approaches to dual enrollment. But in general, most state legislators seem to be thrilled by the idea of having students, get part of their college education done more quickly and cheaply in high school. So I think they're anxious to see this implemented in as many places as possible. The challenge is for places that are either so remote from a university or college that they're kind of not on the radar for that university or college to reach out and set up a dual enrollment program. But I think the other challenge is not having enough teachers with the credentials to, who have that master's and 18 credit hours to offer those classes.
So in your opinion, in your opinion, do you believe that these courses are less rigorous because they're taught on a high school level by people who may have master's degrees but not necessarily in the discipline that they're teaching in, or what's your philosophy on that?
Well, I mean, again, there's so many of these that it's hard to say definitively, but my sense is that these are, as I said in the article, they're classes taught in high schools by high school teachers to high school students, their high school courses. That said, I think it's possible to offer high quality, with a small number of students, a small percentage of high school students, to really offer a rigorous, probably equal to most college level courses in a high school. That said, I don't think it happens very often. Part of the problem is it's really hard to do a rigorous analysis of the rigor in a course because that's such an abstract concept. But just to give you a sense of how this works, in my particular field, where I teach as an Africanist, I always teach world history as my kind of gen ed survey course. If you take the world history as a concurrent course, as a college level world history course, you do that as a high school sophomore, because that's the year they offer world history in high school. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I was totally ready for college level work when I got to college, much less when I was a sophomore in high school. And so I think there's just a question of the maturity of students. How rigorous can you be with how old? What are you, 15 and when you're a sophomore in high school?
14, 15.
Yeah. And I was once a grader a reader for the World History AP exam, which is, it's similar to dual enrollment. The difference is that there's this kind of outside oversight. But when I was a reader for the World History AP, one of the things they kept saying is the people who were running the grading process is, keep in mind these are high school sophomores. Well, if it's supposed to be a college level attainment, you shouldn't be keeping in mind that these are high school sophomores, and they should be held to the same standard that you would a college student. So I think part of what the challenge in all of this is that your brain's not fully mature, really, till you're probably 23, 24. So I think there's a real question as to whether people are, no matter the resources available to the school and the cleverness of the students, the just sort of general intellectual maturity of some of the students taking these courses is not, they're not ready for college level stuff.
One of the points that you touched on in the article was about the benefits of dual enrollment in these concurrent type of programs where they provide a less amount of tuition that a student and their parent must pay by staying at home and also getting high school credits. But you also focused on the inequality in the sense that some students may not be able to pay that upfront cost while they're in high school. Parents might not be able to pay for that cost. What do you suggest should be done about that type of system where some people might not be able to pay for these courses and take advantage of this type of program?
Well, I know in Arkansas they've started and I don't know if it's done on a kind of ad hoc basis by universities or if it's a state policy, but they're starting to provide some waivers for students who can't afford to do those classes. And I believe, again, I may be mistaken about this, but I believe that the Department of Education, Betsy DeVos, Secretary DeVos, has talked about allowing people to get Pell Grant money when they're in high school to pay the cost of for dual enrollment courses. So on some level, that would be less bad than the current system. I think the best answer would be to say, let's do high school and high school and college and college, and keep the two things separate for everybody. But if that's not on the table, then probably making it easier for people who might struggle to come up with an extra $100, $200, which is a bargain for a college course, but it's still real money. When you have to sort of plunk down cash on the barrelhead.
Yeah, I looked at another article that you sent me earlier about, I think it's Senate Bill 456, where they spoke about offering a set-aside amount of money from excess lottery funding to go towards some of these scholarships for dual enrollment students. There was not really a budgeted amount because I read the bill. Do you think that the state is really invested in trying to expand this program and to make it more available to people who might not be able to afford these type of programs, or is this something that is seen as a program that could be expanded in the future, but not a lot of emphasis should be put on it now?
Well, I think the state has always been quite interested in dual enrollment. In part, I think we have an extremely conservative state legislature, and I think part of what drives all of this is a mistrust of higher education, and for kind of political and ideological reasons. And so I think for a lot of our state legislators, the more college that happens with high school teachers they trust, the better. So I think that's one of the reasons that they support this. The other reason, or the other element to this, is I think there's an increasing sense that colleges, this kind of just hoop or hurdle you're expected to jump over, that, and everything that happens there is kind of arbitrary and pointless, and that the easier we make it for people to get through that process and get this credential, the better. And so the fewer of those, and Gen Ed is, I think, in particular seen, and it's Gen Ed courses, the introductory chemistry, introductory history, introductory English, and so forth, that's getting done in the high schools. Those courses, those types of courses are, I think, often perceived as almost like a kind of a tax that's levied on students. Okay, you want to study nursing or business? Well, you're going to have to take all these. You have to learn about Shakespeare first, right? Even if you have no interest in Shakespeare, but if you want to be a nurse, we're going to force you to sit through the Shakespeare class. And so I think for a lot of our state legislators, they would just as soon see all of that go away, and the students just be able to, get a nursing degree and be done with it. And so they have I think they're genuinely committed to making this work for as many people as possible. The lottery funds, they're already having trouble meeting at least in Arkansas, we had this lottery scholarship. It has some other less gambling sounding name, like the Hope Scholarship or something, but everybody calls it the lottery scholarship, where we created a lottery. The revenue from that was going to pay for scholarships. And they've had to steadily cut back the amount of money they pay out for scholarships. It's now a kind of a tiered system where the longer you stay in school, the more they pay you. But the initial payout for the first year is lower than it was when the program started. So if that program has enough surplus revenue to start paying for people to take classes in high school, I don't know if that's a reasonable way to try to find money to pay for that. But I do think that Arkansas state legislators and state legislators in many states are genuinely committed to making these programs available to as many people as possible. I think it's a terrible idea, but I think it's what they're trying to do and going to do.
Yeah, I was analyzing a bill, and I didn't see a merit component. I didn't see an income component to these scholarships. I just saw basically if you apply for these type of programs and you complete an assessment success plan, then you would be eligible. But there's no merit, income, or anything to say that these are specific standards that you have to have. Here's the reason for these standards, and this would be something that might lead you to get this type of scholarship.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's sort of, there was an article, I can't remember where I saw it, but just yesterday or the day before, it was either the Chronicle of Higher Education at the Times or something, about the city of Kalamazoo's experiment with free college. The city of Kalamazoo created a system maybe 10 years ago or something, whereby if you were a student in the Kalamazoo schools and you were accepted to college, this program would pay your tuition, not your fees or not your living expenses, but it would pay your college tuition. And you didn't even have to go to school in state, I don't think. You could even go to school out of state. And I believe the thing is still going. And so they did a study of who benefited from this. And the conclusion was it pretty much benefited people who were probably going to go to college anyway. They just they didn't have to pay their tuition, but they still had, their families still had the means to pay living expenses. And so if you went to University of Michigan, your tuition would be paid, but your family would then only have to pay for your apartment and food and so forth. And so for upper middle class families that already had 4-year colleges in sight, this turned out to be a huge boon. And people actually started moving into Kalamazoo out of the suburbs in order to take advantage of the program. For poorer students, and frequently also minorities, they tended to go to community college. Their graduation rate from both 4-year and 2-year colleges went up only incrementally, like from 23% to 24% or something like that. And they appear to have benefited far less from the free college thing than the sort of upper middle class white and Asian students. So I suspect, and I don't think that was anybody's intention when they started the free college program in Kalamazoo, but that was the effect. And my guess is that a similar thing is going to happen with this program in Arkansas to help defray the cost of these. It will, people who already had the $200 to pay for the class or the $100 or whatever it is are not going to have to pay that. And people who didn't have it may, it may help them. It probably will help them, but it'll still probably provide a significant benefit to people who were already in those classes and already benefit. It'll simply make that first year of college even cheaper for them.
Senator Joyce Elliott from Little Rock, Arkansas, she was quoted in this article, Colleges in State Embrace Younger Learners. She was quoted saying that she wanted an intrusive outreach to reach those students who may be first in their families to attend college or are unaware of these opportunities. Is there some type of database or some type of push that you see in the state of Arkansas to make these type of programs available to the people who need them most?
I don't know. My guess would be no. But that it also would not be terribly difficult to figure out, where those resources were most needed. If you're not sort of up on Arkansas demography, there are three sort of regions of the state. There's the kind of mountainous northwest, which is almost all white. There's the Delta, which is probably 50-50 black and white. And then there's southern Arkansas, which is sort of a pine timber region that has sort of pockets that are all white and pockets that are almost all black. And the Delta, I mean, if you wanted to really focus on making those things available to minorities, these types of opportunities available to minorities, it'd be very simple to focus on high schools in the Delta. So I don't know if you would need an elaborate database. It's the kind of segregated nature of the high schools is such that it'd be pretty easy to identify the ones that most need those types of opportunities.
Also, the Department of Higher Education Secretary, I believe her name is Markham, she made a comment in the same article about seeking data from these colleges and universities to track by race and income to see how effective these type of programs are in terms of enrollment, graduation, and things of that nature. But she said that's something that is going to be focused on in the future. Do you think that that's something that should be tracked immediately to try to get, I guess, the best and most sincere outcome if the focus is actually expanding this type of program?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be to know what actually happens to students who take that route. My guess, though, is that what they will do is simply try to see how many of those students graduate. I think a much more interesting thing and to do would be to look at the performance of students who or to compare the performance of students who do their gen ed in college as opposed to students who do their gen ed in high school. If you had students with comparable ACT scores and comparable GPAs in two different pools and you could compare outcomes for them, I think it would tell you something about the effectiveness of doing all that stuff in high school. And I know our College of Math and Science here started an inquiry like that, where they were looking at how, I think it was chemistry majors who did their Gen Chem 1 and Gen Chem 2 in high school did compared to chemistry majors who did their Gen Chem 1 and Gen Chem 2 in college. And what they found, if I remember correctly, is that the ones who did the Gen Chem 1 and 2 here at the university did better in upper level courses than the ones who had taken those courses in high school and then jumped into them in college. So I think that would be a really interesting, to do a bigger, more rigorous, controlled version of that study would be really useful, because I think it would tell you something about the consequences of those courses. I think the implicit assumption of the Department of Education, our Department of Higher Education in Arkansas, is that those courses are a good thing and that they are looking for evidence to show that as many people as possible are benefiting from them, rather than testing whether they are in fact a good thing or not.
So what you talked about the free education model that you referenced in Kalamazoo, Michigan. What do you think of Senator Bernie Sanders' idea of free college education to kind of, decrease some of these wealth gaps or educational attainment gaps as a way to kind of counter these programs like dual enrollment that creates inequality further? What do you think about his plan to do free education for state institutions?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea. One, for the sort of reasons that have been pointed out for what happened in Kalamazoo, is I think the Sanders plan would unintentionally, I think, end up being a subsidy for people who can already afford to go to college, and probably be less useful. I think it'd be far better if it were means tested. If instead of giving everybody free college, you did more to support, make Pell Grants bigger and reduce people's dependence on student loans would be, I think, a far, so that people who qualify for Pell Grants get more money would be a far more useful thing than, subsidizing college education for middle-class people who can already reasonably afford it. And, people complain about the growing cost of college education, but a lot of times what they're talking about is the, $50,000 a year private schools on the East and West Coasts, and not, your local public institution like Arkansas State, which for upper middle-class people, the cost of that is quite attainable. I mean, I think you're talking about $7,000 a year in tuition or something like that. But that's still a lot of money. If you, I think, trying to think, a full 20 or 30% of our students here come from households with household incomes below $18,000 a year. $7,000 is a lot of money if your household income is $18,000 a year. So for people in that situation, I think, free college makes all kinds of sense. But subsidizing the local doctor's kids to go to ASU for free doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I don't think. And I think the Kalamazoo experiment. Go ahead.
I was going to say, so an amendment to the plan, making it means tested in terms of financially, or should it be a merit-based component, or should it be just income-based?
Well, that I think that's a different issue, and I think that there's free college, and then there's a whole discussion of sort of college for everyone. And I think as soon as you get college for everyone, college will cease. You just create a kind of arms race. Right now, people use college degrees to distinguish themselves from high school, and we pretty much do high school for everyone now, right? That's the default assumption, is that everybody will go to high school. Not everybody finishes, but our assumption is that everybody will go to high school. As soon as the assumption becomes that everybody goes to college, a college degree is going to be about as valuable as a high school degree in terms of employment. And then everybody's going to need a master's degree, or some and then once everybody has a master's degree, you're going to need some other degree. So I think you do need to make college more available to people who are prepared to take advantage of that. At the same time, I think there's a risk in trying to just shovel everybody into college and assume that's going to fix everything for everybody. I think we would be far better served by, European-style apprenticeship programs and things like that. I don't know if there was an article by Nick Hanauer in The Atlantic maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago called Educationism, it had the word educationism in the title. And he basically said that, we're trying to use education to fix all of the country's problems. And he's a billionaire investor, kind of guy. And he maintains that the reason investing in educational reform is so appealing to people like him and Bill Gates and other people with billions of dollars is that it creates it sort of fosters the idea that if we can just fix education and make it available, sufficient amounts of college and high-quality college and high schools and so forth available to all Americans, that'll fix the inequality problem. And they'll get to keep their billions of dollars. And he said, this is false. The problems are bigger than education, and having everybody go to college isn't going to fix the sort of social inequality and economic inequality problems we have in the country. It's tempting to believe that, especially if you have billions of dollars and would like to keep them. But the real fix is probably going to be something more radical than free college. And it's probably going to cost those guys more of their billions.
Sounds like some type of taxation or New Deal type of program is something drastic that you're talking about?
Well, yeah. I mean, or what Hanauer is talking about. He doesn't lay out any specifics, but he has warned on other occasions, like an article I think in 2014 in Politico, that people like himself and his fellow billionaires need to do something, or they should expect angry mobs with pitchforks. So I think he is aware of the sort of explosive potential of inequality in the country, and is concerned now that everybody is sort of banking too much on the potential of higher education or just education in general to fix that issue. So I think Sanders is Oh, go ahead.
No, you could go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Bernie Sanders is entirely well-intentioned with all of this. I lived in Vermont for a long time. I'm used to seeing Bernie at the 4th of July parade in Warren, Vermont, and so forth. But it's a nice idea, but I don't think it's going to fix anything big. It'll make life easier for some middle-class families that would otherwise have to shell out college tuition, but it's not going to address cost of living and those sorts of things that are still going to be expenses. And the advantages will accrue probably more to wealthier people than they do to poor people, just like the Kalamazoo situation did, even though that was not the intention of either of those programs.
What is the name of the billionaire that you referenced from the Atlantic article?
Nick Hanauer.
Nick Hanauer?
Yeah, let me just check the spelling on Hanauer. I get my amazing powers of Google here.
His comments that you referenced about there being pitchforks of people being angry over their financial situation, that sounds almost similar to the picture that Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate, talked about, where his solution to this type of inequality is to suggest something like a universal basic income of, I think, $1,000 a month. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. I think he's also a very wealthy guy, and that is actually among the billionaire set. that seems to be a fairly popular idea. And I think that is in part because they are anxious to, as all of us non-billionaires become increasingly less useful to them, that will have the potential to sort of, as work changes and as machines can do more and more of what a lot of us do. I mean, it's coming in all kinds of, it seems to be coming in all kinds of different, it's easy to imagine self-driving trucks eliminating truck driving jobs. Pretty easy for me to imagine algorithms grading a lot of freshman essays. You may no longer need a person with a master's degree in 18 hours to teach a high school course. Pretty soon the computer may be able to do it itself. And probably the computers will take the class also for the students. We may all become largely irrelevant. And I think the universal basic income is appealing to those people because it's a way of adapting to a world in which there's a lot less work available to people, to the vast majority of people.
Okay,
I'm not sure that it's a bad idea, but I do think their motives are more complicated than just making us all $1,000 a month richer.
So to kind of wrap it up, what suggestions would you give to students or parents who may not be, like I said earlier, have the type of access to these type of programs to take advantage of these type of situations so that they could go into higher education with less debt and to be more prepared? What would you suggest that these parents and students do to get prepared and possibly take advantage of this dual enrollment craze that's taken over the country?
Well, I think if it's at your school, you'd probably be silly not to participate. If it's not at your school, and not all schools offer dual enrollment, or they may not offer that many courses, I think that's when you need to start showing up at school board meetings and demanding that school boards make these things available. Now, I would much prefer that everybody did their gen ed in college. I think that would be a far better approach to this. But that's a fight that would be really hard for parents of high school students to fight on their own. So in terms of if you have a kid and you're in a high school that doesn't have college algebra as a concurrent enrollment course, I think that's where you go and yell at the school board and agitate for, elect people who are willing to make those things happen.
Do you have any upcoming events or research on this topic that you might want to share with the audience so they could probably do some more research on you?
No, I've actually, most of my sort of agitation has been about learning outcomes assessment. But if people want to kind of follow up with what I'm doing with higher education stuff, I have a blog called badassessment.org where I write about learning outcomes assessment, but other like that Nick Hanauer article. I did a blog piece about that and had an excerpt of Hanauer's thing on there. So if people want to kind of follow up with what's annoying me at any particular moment, badassessment.org is a good place to look.
Perfect. Any social media?
No, I'm other than Strava, which is for bike racing, I don't do social media.
Okay, so we'll just put the blog in the description.
Okay. Yeah, I can send you a link.
Perfect. No, please do. Thanks for the time, and if there's any type of news on this topic, will we be able to reach out to you and get you on the podcast again?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Perfect. Thank you for your time, and appreciate that.
All right. Enjoyed talking to you.
Sure.
Bye.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and or the pinned comment section. The question lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.